Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
So the format that we're going to take tonight is, for the first section of our discussion, I've prepared a set of questions that I've shared with our two participants so that they had a sense to think about it ahead of time. And we'll give them a chance to respond to these questions and hopefully to also engage in some dialogue together. And then around 8:35, 8:45, we will turn to questions from the audience for either one of our panelists. So that's the setup. And I want to start today with asking both of you a worldview question. You know, our title tonight is Making Sense of the Universe. And we'd really like to draw on your personal and professional experience and expertise as relating to this question. How do you make sense of the universe? But I want you to begin really to tell us what your personal worldview is, and just give us some brief insights of the influences and experiences that have brought you to these beliefs. And let's start with John.
Well, thank you very much. And may I say, first of all, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. I'm deeply honored to be invited to this prestigious institution, and even more honored to have a discussion companion of such eminence as Peter. I have been started to read his book, and I found it so utterly fascinating that I was tempted to spend tonight reading it instead of coming here. But he says at the beginning of it something that really resonated with me, and it's this: reality has no artificial professional boundaries. And I thought that's such a setting for a discussion, that he's a neuroscientist and I'm a pure mathematician. In one sense, we're poles apart. But we're both human beings with an interest in pursuing the big questions. And so it's a particular honor for me to be allowed to sit with you, Peter. My worldview: I'm a Christian. And my worldview started when I was quite small, because I was born in a family of convinced Christians in Northern Ireland. And the interesting thing there is that my parents, though Christian, were not sectarian, in a very sectarian country, and they paid for it by being bombed on several occasions. The second thing, which was even more unusual, was that they allowed me to think. And they exposed me to alternative worldviews from a very young age. I think I was 12 when my father brought in a book, and he said, "Have you ever read this?" I said, "What is it?" He says, "It's the Communist Manifesto." I said, "Actually, I haven't, Dad." "Well, you should, because you need to know what these people think." And that set a pattern. And when I went to Cambridge, I had a conversation that changed my life. And it was, somebody asked me if I believed in God, and then they said, "Oh, sorry, I forgot you're Irish. All you Irish believe in God and fight about it." And you see, you know, in Ireland we met various atheists. There were Protestant atheists and there were Catholic atheists, you know, but real atheists I hadn't really met. And in my first week at Cambridge, I thought, look, here I've got a great opportunity to get to know people who do not share my worldview. That's what a university's for, of course. And so I befriended somebody who was an agnostic and started to talk to him. He became a Christian after 2 years' discussion. And what that taught me was that you can possibly change your worldview. Now, I pursued this, and I was delighted to find that Peter and I are both Alexander von Humboldt Fellows. In fact, we could continue this in German, but that wouldn't be very helpful. It might be, but there we are. And I went to Germany, got the language, so that I could go regularly to East Germany, because I was interested in what the worldview of atheism, the opposite to what I believe, did in a culture. And because I've been interested in the Russian language for a long time, after the wall fell, I started going to Russia to do the same thing, meeting people who didn't hold my worldview, and therefore testing my Christian worldview against that. So I'm a Christian. I believe that there is a God who is eternal and personal, and who created the universe and upholds it in being, and who specially in space-time revealed himself in Jesus Christ. So that's basically where I stand.
Okay, thanks. Peter?
Well, it's also an honor to be here and be able to have a nice discussion with John Lennox. And I hope it is a discussion and a dialogue and not the typical sort of confrontational stance you see from these so-called new atheists. I think I was chosen by the students, somewhat to my surprise, to represent the point of view of science. And I do believe in the worldview of science in the sense that I think it's the best we have for understanding what is. I believe that science is an ontological enterprise. It's fundamentally about trying to form models about what is on the basis of evidence. And I would contrast that with dogmatism. So a dogmatist has a model or theory in mind and knows it to be true. Based on what? Well, it depends. Often it's simply a matter of faith, just because. And a dogmatist will look for evidence that supports his or her pre-existing model. Science, ideally, and that certainly doesn't always operate like this in practice, and there's a lot of dogmatists even within science, but ideally, science collects the facts, collects the evidence, and then tries to find a model that fits those facts. And therefore, scientists wake up each morning, ideally, and say, how can I better my model? How can I prove myself wrong? It's a fundamentally different orientation. Whereas a dogmatist is closed-minded because they already know the truth, a scientist ideally should be open-minded and looking for more and more evidence to get a better and better model of reality. Now that said, I think scientists need to be humble because science is fundamentally an ontological enterprise. It's about what is. I think science has to remain largely mute about questions of how to live, how to treat one another, what is good. Science can inform these things. For example, John gave the example over dinner that, science might be able to establish at what point a fetus can feel pain. And that's information that will inform our ethical decisions. But fundamentally, science has to remain mute about these issues. And I see this as the domain of spiritualities and religions. And the problems tend to arise, I think, when scientists try to impose this ontological enterprise of science onto issues of morality, ethics, aesthetics, how we should live. And conversely, when religious dogmatists try to impose their domain onto our ontological domain and say, this in fact happened. And then scientists say, okay, show me the evidence, right? You say resurrection happened? Okay, well, let's see the evidence for that. You can't go back to the Bible as evidence for that. That's circular, right? Is your claim falsifiable? What would you do if you, for example, found the bones of Jesus in some cave? Would your whole worldview collapse? Just because you found some bones? Isn't the message of Jesus something that is not dependent on those bones? Whether he was God or not, isn't it a valid claim to try to live with love and forgiveness, to love our neighbor and turn the other cheek? So I would say that religion has a valid domain, and it should be encouraged. I'm certainly not one of these people who argues that religion should be banished. I think that's very unwise. Also, it's unpractical. It's almost a universal of all human cultures that there are religions. It seems that we may even be pre-wired to look for agency even where there is none. And so we shouldn't try to banish this. We should try to cultivate new forms of spirituality that are consistent with science and rationality. And conversely, we should cultivate forms of rationality that are themselves perhaps spiritual in orientation.
Great, thanks, Peter. So I know both of you have done a lot of significant thinking about the nature of the universe. And I want to start with a fairly basic question. And to raise the intellectual stakes and challenge for you, I want you to answer it in 3 minutes or less. All right. And the question I'm going to ask both of you is, why is there a universe at all? And so, Peter, why don't I start with you? From your perspective, how do we make sense of that fact, that there is something rather than nothing?
So the question is, why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there a universe at all? And the very short answer is, I don't know. I don't think really anyone truly knows, and I think it's okay to admit that. And I think we may never know, and that's also okay. I think it's very important to be able to live with uncertainty. I'm going to read a quote that I just love by the physicist Richard Feynman. I can live with doubt and uncertainty and not knowing. I think it is much more interesting to live not knowing than to have answers that might be wrong. If we will only allow that as we progress, we remain unsure, we will leave opportunities for alternatives. We will not become enthusiastic for the fact, the knowledge, the absolute truth of the day, but remain always uncertain. In order to make progress, one must leave the door to the unknown ajar. So science is fundamentally about the unknown. We are trying to discover new things, which is to say we try to learn everything that's known and then push the envelope so that we make discoveries about the unknown. So scientists have to be comfortable with uncertainty. And it reminds me of a book that I read when I was much younger. It was by William James called Pragmatism and the Meaning of Truth. And in it, William James talks about children, how all children are like little scientists asking questions, or maybe scientists are like little children, but they're asking questions. Why is the sky blue? Why am I here, right? And slowly over time, he noticed, often as children become adolescents, they start to become more and more uncomfortable with uncertainty, whereas as children they were comfortable with uncertainty. And often people will lock into some kind of ideology and say, well, now I'm certain, now I'm right? Because this feeling of uncertainty, of doubt, he argued was painful. In fact, he argued that truth might even be the cessation of doubt in a psychological sense. And then he said, well, but there's a minority of the population that doesn't succumb to this, that doesn't have a strong need for certainty, and these end up being your artists, writers, explorers, scientists, and so forth. And then he wondered, why? What is it about this small minority that continues to search and is uncomfortable with uncertainty? And then he wondered, what kind of educational system could we develop that would foster adults remaining in a childlike state? So I don't know the answer to why the universe exists, and I may never know, we may never know, but that's okay.
Do you think, theoretically, is it knowable? Coming from within your worldview? Scientists, based on math and physics, can reconstruct quite a bit of what seems to have happened within milliseconds, shorter than milliseconds of the Big Bang. Is that gap surmountable, or is it always unknowable?
I honestly don't know how you could establish the final truth of a claim about the beginning of the universe, because the beginning of the universe is not observable. Right? Science is about what is observable and taking what is observable, namely facts, and inferring the nature of reality. Now, of course, we have indications of what may be remnants of what may have been a Big Bang, the background microwave radiation, and I think that counts as evidence. We actually see the past when we look through the Hubble telescope and can see close to the so-called beginning of the universe. But in some ways, I think reason reaches its limits when it tries to confront ideas that may not even be definable. Like, what does the proposition before the beginning mean? What does it mean? Or outside of everything, what does that mean? These terms might not be definable. I'm not saying that cosmologists don't have a valid domain of science. I think that they do, and that we as scientists can try to work out the beginning of the universe and get closer and closer to this idea of what might have been the beginning, but what might have then been before the beginning or triggered the beginning, I think is not clear.
Thanks. So John, turning to you, coming from within a belief system where there's a all-powerful creator God, that tends to be connected with the existence of something rather than nothing. But doesn't that really beg the question, in some sense, is that why is there a God in the first place? And does the concept of God really help us have a significant understanding of the why of the universe?
Well, the irony is really about this whole question is it's the moderate certainty of science that creates the problem. Because most cosmologists I know have come to the conclusion that space-time has a beginning. They also have come to the notion that it started from nothing. And as I look at it, I find it amusing, in fact, that the desperate attempt to get something from nothing on a physical basis is running into sand. And the problem is that people like Stephen Hawking and Lawrence Krauss have resorted to the desperate extent of redefining nothing. And when I read an astrophysicist like Krauss saying, because something is physical, nothing must be physical, especially if you define it as the absence of something, I say, what? And it's very interesting to my mind, and I take Peter's view in a sense, that there are things we don't know. But I would have a caveat here. We don't have any concept of physical causation of physics, because according to the cosmologists, there was no space-time, there was nothing. So they're completely stuck. And so they have to redefine nothing and call it a quantum vacuum, which isn't nothing, and so on. So coming round to the nuance of the direct question to me, I do believe in inference to the best explanation. Peter's point is well taken, that we cannot observe the beginning of the universe, so we have to have inference to the best explanation. Now, is nothing becoming something on the lines that has been suggested a good explanation? I don't think so. I think by far and away the explanation that makes sense is that an eternal God who is spirit caused it to exist in the first place. That is, it wasn't something from nothing, it was something from nothing physical. God is spirit. And you see, we live in an academy often dominated by a physicalism that there's nothing but mass energy. And I'm passionate about science. And we need to develop our explanations in terms of the constituent bits of the universe. But you see, I happen to believe that the primary reality in the universe is not mass energy at all, it's spirit. Mass energy is derivative. So that reverses the whole picture for me. Now, the specific question, who created God, which has been popularized by Richard Dawkins, and I've had one or two spats with him on this, is what philosophers call a complex question, because if you ask who created God, you're assuming God is created. What created X? You assume X is created. So the question only applies to created gods. So that's the first point. He's not even talking about the God of the Bible, because the God of the Bible wasn't created. And that's a profoundly important thing that's stated in one of the most famous observations in the Bible on the origin of the universe. In the beginning was the Word. That is an existence statement. The Word already was. All things came to be through him. That's also an existence statement. They are derivative. But the Word never came to be. He always was. Now, turning it round, you see, when Dawkins put that to me and said this is a valid question, I said, Richard, it's a valid question, really, of created God, so let me put it to you. You believe the universe created you, so who created your creator? And I've waited 7 years for an answer to that question. So it seems to me that being serious at the back of this, we're asking the profound question of what is the nature of ultimate reality? Because I find that with my atheist friends, of whom I've many, and my agnostic friends, they don't go backwards infinitely with questions. They stop with mass energy, or the energy of the universe. And that's their ultimate reality. Now, for me, that's not the ultimate reality. It's a derivative reality. The ultimate reality is God. But the who created God question, I never expected to hear from a professor of Oxford. I used to hear it from children, but there we are.
Any reactions to that, Peter? In a sense, John identified some points of commonality, but a fundamental difference, and just be interesting to hear your reactions to.
Well, I'm a naturalist. I believe that there is only nature, and that if we were to even if there were a God, it would be a natural process, not a supernatural one. If it were supernatural, it would be outside the domains of the universe as we understand it, outside the domains of the laws of nature. I think it is a problem for theists, the proposition that something existed before the existence of the universe and that thing itself wasn't itself created. I think it's probably incoherent. But I believe, even though I am a physicalist and I am a naturalist, that there's a way to have a spiritual life, and it doesn't build itself upon a belief system. It's not necessary to believe in the resurrection or that God created the universe to nonetheless have a life based upon trying to be good, trying to be kind, trying to better ourselves. And in fact, I think religions in the future will more and more emphasize practice rather than belief. And when religion tries to kind of confront science on its home turf, which is ontology, what is, I think religion's at a big disadvantage. But this other domain, how we should live, how we should have our communities, how we should transform our minds through practices like meditation, science has nothing really to say about that, and that is the most valid domain of religion.
So, John, you're both using words like physical and spiritual or spirituality. Are you talking about the same things? Are your categories the same here?
Well, I haven't used either of the words spiritual or spirituality, actually.
Okay, granted.
Because
well, God is spirit.
Not that I'm against them.
Yes.
I think that it's not an adjective, it's a noun. That God is spirit. There is a prime reality that is spirit. And Peter's point interests me when he said that it's incoherent to think of God existing before the universe. I think it probably is. But I think that the relationship of God to time may be infinitely more complex than we imagine. That God caused this space-time continuum to exist doesn't require us to logically involve some kind of obvious self-contradiction in the statement of it. I think it may be very much deeper than that. And you see, inference to best explanation for me is here we have a universe which is rationally accessible to a certain extent. And you, fascinatingly, you're studying the inner universe, the brain, and cosmologists are looking at the outer universe. Well, if I step back from that, you see, what that says to me, as just looking at it, is the most sensible ultimate explanation of that is that the fact that we can do science at all is a result of the universe being created by a rational spirit. That makes sense to me. It doesn't make sense to me to assume that nature is all that exists and that mass energy can somehow climb its way up to produce intelligence. It seems to me that the other way around makes infinitely more sense. So from that sort of global perspective, I sit where I sit, so to speak.
May I say something?
Sure, please.
So that something makes sense to you doesn't make it true.
No,
and
it doesn't make it false either.
No, that's true.
Yeah.
I grant that. But I think we have to be especially skeptical of finding evidence for things that we want to be true. Honestly, I would love there to be a caring God. I don't believe in a caring consciousness out there who's taking care of me, but I would love it if such a being were out there right now and taking care of all those thousands of people dying of Ebola right now. I don't see evidence of that, and I think that a scientist has to take the evidence and confront it really as an adult and say, okay, it looks like with the cessation of the brain, there's the cessation of the mind. It looks like upon death, there is no soul. There's no evidence for the contrary position. And to say it makes sense to me or I have faith in it is not evidence. It's not sufficient for a scientist anyway to...
Well, we agree, if I might respond to that, Peter, that evidence is a crucial thing. Right. My faith in God is evidence-based, as is my faith in the scientific method. And I think one of the biggest evidences is that we can do science at all, that we trust our intelligence, Now, if our intelligence is the end product ultimately of a mindless, unguided process, we wouldn't trust a computer if we knew it was the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And this is a thing that people like Thomas Nagel now are pointing out, and he's an atheist philosopher, as you know. And he's saying this naturalistic view of the universe that's got no transcendence is in danger of destroying itself, because ultimately it removes all kind of meaning to the very words we use to do our science. So I think that the whole scientific endeavor is evidence, and that connects, and this may be another question, but that connects with me with the fact historically that the rise of modern science is very closely linked with Christianity. As C.S. Lewis put it, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. So there are those kind of connections that I feel go extremely deep, and they form part of the evidence. If that makes sense to you.
Let me take it just a slightly different direction. In some ways, I think it's a related question, but coming from a very different angle. I want us to think a little bit, again, back to the nature of the universe and how we understand that and how we make sense of that. And particularly, I'd like us to talk a little bit about whether this system we have, this physical system anyways, is a deterministic system. And Peter, in your book and other places, I know you've argued that quantum effects are a big part of this, that disrupt a deterministic system. And it would be helpful if you could explain a little bit more what that means and how that works in your mind.
All right. So determinism is the claim essentially that from the beginning, say in this case it might be the Big Bang, there's only one possible future. Everything that happens has to unfold, more or less like a movie. You can imagine a movie with Woody Allen in it, and it's just unfolding. And Woody Allen in the movie might say, you know, I have free will, I do. But it's just unfolding like a movie. Everything that happens has to happen because there's only one possible future. The alternative is usually proposed to be indeterminism, which many people think of as just utter randomness. It's just random stuff happens. And it seems under indeterminism as well, understood as utter randomness, that you wouldn't have much say in the matter either. Random stuff would just happen, you know, little ants with top hats would start dancing around out of nowhere for no reason, just random stuff would happen, and that doesn't seem to be the case. Random stuff that's utterly random doesn't seem to happen. And the question then is there a middle ground? You know, is there a point between the sort of the Scylla of determinism where there's no freedom because, you know, there's only one thing that can happen, and the Charybdis of randomness? Is there a middle way that does afford some degree of human freedom? And I think the answer is yes. And that's because the physical system of the brain is able to parameterize, set up the conditions or the criteria that future neural activity will have to meet. So it is true that, you know, mental events, information processing in the brain right now can't change its physical basis right now, but it can change the conditions that future mental activity will have to meet. So to make this concrete, you know, I can give you some question like, you know, think of somebody who has red hair. So that's a criterion. Well, you might have thought of, you know, Margaret Thatcher or Ron Weasley or Pumuckl or somebody, you know, but Ronald McDonald, you know, but why do you think of that one versus any of the others? Well, there's a degree of randomness there, but it's not utterly random because it had to be a person who had red hair. But it's not utterly deterministic either because it could have turned out differently. Now, your physical system of the brain is constantly rewiring itself on a millisecond timescale, taking advantage of this. And I think that this requires amplification of randomness, ultimately from the quantum domain up to the level of neural activity. And a lot of my book is looking specifically at that question. How do you amplify random events in the synapse up to a level of neuronal spike timing differences? And I won't get into the details, but I think there's very strong evidence for such amplification. Then the deeper question is the universe truly indeterministic? And I think the evidence there is, again, very strong. In fact, quantum theory is built upon this idea. The fundamental substance is not really energy, it's something that physicists call action. and it has the units of energy, time, or momentum, space, or position. And what Max Planck first came to understand was that this seems to be quantized. And the quantization of action has very deep implications. You've certainly heard of the uncertainty relationship of Heisenberg. Well, you know, the word he used was actually, the German word is Unbestimmtheit, which really means indeterminacy. And an implication of that is that there's a kind of uncertainty in particular outcomes. Now, the beauty of quantum theory is that it's extremely precise, and in fact, it's deterministic at the level of the stochastic or population level of probability. So what does that mean? Insurance companies make a lot of money because of stochastic determinism. So, you know, every year in Boston, say, you know, around 73 people get bitten by dogs, and next year it's 72, and next year it's 69. The sort of predictability allows, you know, the John Hancock Tower to be the tallest building. But which person gets bitten and which dogs are involved, it's not foreseeable. So similarly, in physical events, quantum theory can predict the distribution, the probability distribution of outcomes very precisely, but it can't predict the particular event that will happen next with those probabilities. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks. You're a mathematician, a theologian. Where do you fall out on the determinism question?
Well, I find myself in great sympathy with this man. I mean, it's so refreshing for me to read this book and come across some of your ideas, Peter, particularly this ontological indeterminism, because I've read so much stuff and so many people would disagree with Peter in this. I find myself resonating that there is a middle path, and I wouldn't want to question any of the science. In fact, one of my decisions I've made in the past 24 hours is to try and understand what you've done, because my impression is it is immensely significant. Because to have someone operating from a physicalist position, giving us evidence, not simply at the quantum level, but higher up in terms of these patterns of energy in the neurons, I think is quite fascinating. Now, where do I stand as a theologian? Well, I stand in exactly the same place, but I'm going to use a little bit of different terminology to describe it. I think determinism is false. If everything were determined, our conversation would be completely meaningless for a start, because every word would have been pre-programmed, and a robotic thing has no ultimate meaning. Now, this is a hugely important matter. From the perspective of my own Christian worldview, God has created not only a universe, but human beings, and he's gifted them with something very special: the capacity to say yes or no. And that capacity, that freedom of will, limited of course, I'm not free to run at 100 miles an hour, and you know that looking at me anyway, but there is a real freedom, and that creates the possibility of the most important things in life: love, morality, and so on. And I think that the Genesis story, simple as all it may appear, is utterly profound. That the highest element in life is that capacity to choose. And the moral definition in Genesis is that everything was allowed except one thing: don't eat of that tree. In that day you will die. And it didn't simply mean physical death. It meant the connection with God would be broken. And that seemed to me to be the biggest gift that we have been given. And so, having a confirmation from a scientist that does not share my worldview, I find is a very encouraging thing indeed. So forgive me for piggybacking on top of your science, but to come to the New Testament, I think it's very important that we realize just how precious this gift is. Jesus once famously wept over Jerusalem, and he said, "I'd love to. How often would I have gathered you as a hen gathers its chickens, but you wouldn't." In other words, we have a real will. We have a real power of choice. And to ram that home, it seems to me to be very important that we have that capacity to trust. We see it in our families, in our friends, and so on. But the biggest use of it is, and that's the challenge I face every day, am I going to use my capacity to trust, which I use in every area of life, am I going to use it to trust God? So I am not a determinist. I'm, of course, not an atheist determinist, but neither am I a Christian determinist. I do feel there's real freedom, which opens up the world of love, of aesthetics, of morality, and so on. And I think that, you know, that my teacher of quantum mechanics, why don't I quote him, Sir John Polkinghorne at Cambridge, he points out that deterministic theories, the radical determinist defeats itself because it destroys all meaning. So that's where I stand on that.
That dovetails nicely into the next question I'd like you both to respond to, and that's really the question of the individual person. You've both been talking about a degree of indeterminism in the world, and that's connected to choices and other things. It's not uncommon today to hear scholars talk about how that notion of a subjective, individual person, embodied soul, whatever the terminology might be, is a bit of a fiction. That really what you have is a set of biological features, and they give the illusion of subjectivity, of freedom, of movement. Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA, put it like this. This is a quote from him. "The astonishing hypothesis is that you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will, are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. As Lewis Carroll's Alice might have phrased it, you're nothing but a pack of neurons." So, Peter, I think particularly in the world of cognitive neuroscience these days, this is a very ripe discussion. It would be interesting how you'd respond to that claim. Does science and what we know about neuroscience lead us to abandon the idea of the human individual?
All right. Listening to Crick's astonishing hypothesis, it strikes me that it's not terribly astonishing. Assuming monism or physicalism, I mean, it simply has to be the case that what we call mental events and our consciousnesses realize in some sense in the physical events of the brain. And I think most cognitive neuroscientists would take that view, and I think that the alternative view, namely dualism, becomes very difficult to maintain because if you have two fundamental substances, say soul and matter, well then how do they interact? Well, take whatever comprises their interaction. Okay, you divide that now into the soul part and the matter part, and how do they interact? You can see there's an infinite regress. So the majority of scientists adhere to one form or another of monism. Now I tend to think that most scientists are physicalists, but that's only one form of monism. Another would be that everything is information. That would be Bishop Berkeley's view. Another could be that everything is spirit. But still, monism itself seems to be the most coherent position because dualism or any other version, higher version of that, seems to fall apart. All right, so let's look at Crick's astonishing hypothesis. Embedded in that hypothesis is the old nothing but argument, right? That's nothing but that. That's no more than that, right? And I think this is where that argument really falls apart, that we are nothing more than a collection of neurons, nothing but a bunch of atoms. I mean, at one level, that's true. We are a bunch of atoms. But what's missing from that notion of just being a collection of atoms is the very important fact that in addition to being a collection of atoms or cells, we are a configuration of atoms and cells that have very particular spatial and temporal relationships, and that it is those configural properties that give rise to higher level or emergent properties. Let me give you an example of what I mean. If I have my hand, it has certain beautiful functionality. I can play the classical guitar, the piano. Now I shove it into a blender. That is a collection of cells, right? Right? What are you really, right? Are you just the atoms that comprise you? Well, every 7 years I hear you're a completely different set of atoms. You're constantly flushing through new atoms. You have different atoms every day. And yet there's something that is enduring over that time. 7 years ago you were made of different matter. But what is maintained is your organization, your pattern. You're a pattern of energy. And so this idea of emergent properties that arise because of the configural properties of energy, the relationships among energy is very important. So let me give you some examples. I can take a radio and I can disembowel it. I can take all the parts and put them on the table, and it won't function as a radio. It's only if I take all the parts and put them together in the right configuration that it takes on the property of being able to convert electromagnetic waves into sound. Another example, take a vein. A vein is made of lots of epithelial cells, but no single cell can function as a tube. It's only through the relationships among the parts that tubeness emerges. Take an airplane wing, is another example, right? No portion of this heavy metal thing can fly, but if you have the right shape and you project it forward, because the air has to traverse a greater distance over the top than the bottom, you have, according to Bernoulli's principle, lift. And in fact, this is how airplanes allow us to fly. But the property of being able to fly doesn't arise from any particular location or any particular atom. It arises through the relationships among atoms. So I don't buy this nothing but argument. I think it's misguided. We are not nothing but a collection of cells because we're not just a collection of cells. We are the relationships among those cells. Now, very fundamental to what I study is information. And one of the core goals of my life is trying to understand how neurons can give rise to consciousness, which I take to be a special form of information that our brains detect and process. And information is realized in matter, but it's not identical to matter. Take your experience of redness. Redness doesn't have mass, but the neurons in which it's realized have mass. Redness doesn't necessarily have position or momentum, but the neurons in which that is realized have position and momentum. So information is, in a sense, an emergent property that comes from the fact that neurons are detecting patterns among their inputs. So pattern becomes very central. In particular, neurons are very sensitive to coincidences among their input. So is personhood under threat? No, I think a person is an informational process that endures over a person's lifetime. It can change, but it is, although it is realized in matter and material events, it is not identical to them. Why? Because material events are not just reducible to an independent collection. In addition to that, you have the spatial and temporal relationships among those parts, and those spatial and temporal relationships are not themselves physical. And yet you can create detectors like neurons that respond to patterns in input, spatial and temporal patterns, allowing information to come into the universe, realized physically and yet not identical to the physical.
So just following up on that a little bit, if we have this remarkably complicated organization of material that gives rise to the ability to interpret our interaction with the environment. Right. How does that account for the qualia aspect of it? Is that an illusion? So, you know, the saltiness of salt, is that real? Or is that, in fact, an illusion so that our system may experience it as something that's vivid and intangible, but in fact, it's really just a sequence of neurons and synapses firing in just the right way, and we label that activity, that brain activity, as saltiness.
So science typically attempts to take what's publicly observable as evidence to construct a model of reality. Now, neuroscience and psychology are very unusual in science in that they're attempting to form models of things that are not publicly observable. I can't observe your mind. I can't observe your feelings and perceptions of redness. I assume you have them, but I don't know how I could possibly prove it. And it becomes very challenging to try to form a science based upon something that's inherently unobservable. What we can observe is neurons. Nonetheless, we know that neurons are processing information. I can't observe information directly. I can only observe the physical basis of it. Now, consciousness, I take to be a type of information that's processed in the brain. There's lots of unconscious types of information being processed in the brain. I think the relationship between this class of information that we call conscious or consciousness is very closely related to what we call volitional attention. So I'll ask you, can you think of something that you're conscious of now that you can't attend in the next moment? Well, certainly everything you're attending right now you're conscious of. But in addition, anything that you're conscious of in the background, you could also shift your attention to it. So it seems from an information processing point of view, that consciousness is a special domain of information. It is the domain of information that is accessible to and operatable upon by volitional attention. It's what allows you to, see a flock of seagulls and then, without moving your eyes, you can put your attention on one of those seagulls and track it around. So I don't think consciousness is something supernatural. I think it's a very natural process, and in fact, it is a kind of information realized in our brains. Now, the qualia problem is, why does something taste salty as opposed to looking blue? Or, why does the sky look blue as opposed to red? And is your red the same as my blue? I think that this is, a very thorny problem. Qualia seem to be very much associated with information of a particular type that makes explicit certain kinds of facts about the world, right? So I don't experience the red wavelength that my cones in my retina detect. I experience red pigments that take into account lots of other information across the visual field. I don't experience the shapes that are present on the retina. I experience the shapes that are inferred to be present in the world. So for example, if I open a door, the shape on my retina is changing radically, but I don't perceive it as deforming as I open the door, right? So then, being a naturalist, I would say, why did this evolve? I'd say qualia evolved and consciousness evolved so that planning areas, in particular volitional attentional areas, have something to operate on, which is our best representation of the world and what's going on in the body right now, so that we can plan what to do next.
So, John, do you think that the incredible advances in science in terms of understanding the way that we interact with the world, particularly neurologically, but not exclusively, have led us to the point where we should abandon more traditional notions of the self, which it has different varieties, but has a spiritual side to it, has a conscious side that isn't specifically biological or materially based?
Not at all. I think Crick's astonishing hypothesis ceases to astonish when you read his book, because in the center of the book he changes track and he says you are largely a collection of neurons. So the astonishing hypothesis disappears on his own statement. Secondly, again, this kind of reductionism, to my mind, destroys rationality and meaning. It's like saying that the writing on that Veritas forum is nothing but molecules of paint on molecules of canvas. And the world of rational discourse, I think, if you dissolve it simply to the firing of synapses, you end up without any meaning at all. Secondly, I think, and it was very interesting just listening to the preceding discussion, that Peter's point that we, of course, are more than a collection of atoms. There is configuration. I would go further than that. It's semiotic configuration. And that is what, for me, is enormous evidence of a transcendent logos. It's very interesting just listening carefully, because the word emergent appeared a number of times. But the illustrations you gave were very interesting. First of all, there was a radio and its parts. It doesn't work till you've got all the parts together. But that radio doesn't emerge from the parts without the input of intelligence. And my problem with the word emergent is it covers so many things. Do you mean it emerges without any input of energy? Does it emerge with a catalyst? Or does it emerge with all of those plus informational input from outside? The other example of the aircraft's exactly the same. It doesn't emerge without informational input from the outside. So what I feel you're building up at my mind, Peter, is a case for an intelligently designed universe. The irony of Crick's work is he discovered DNA. That's the longest word in any language we've ever discovered. And it's interesting that the language of computer science has been taken by people like Maynard Smith into biology. So we talk about codons, we talk about the genetic code, and so on. And as I say, the current irony to my mind is that some of my colleagues who work in this field, if they see Veritas forum up there, they immediately deduce, they induct upwards, that they see, because that has got semiotic content, that those are signs or symbols, but they have meaning. Whatever automatic, semi-automatic, natural processes have produced that poster, they know there's a mind involved in it. And the very same people will look at the DNA with 3.4 billion, 3.5 billion letters in it and say chance and the laws of nature. That doesn't stack up to me. And so when the word emergent is used, I say, by what mechanism? Consciousness evolved. What do you mean by evolved? How do you know? And I come the other way round, because on this question, I would regard myself, and here I'm almost probably will commit blasphemy in Dartmouth, I would say I was a dualist. I do not think that matter is the only kind of stuff in the universe. And I was very interested to read David Chalmers a while back. And fascinatingly, I discovered that although he prefers a reductive explanation of consciousness, temperamentally he said, I'm strongly inclined towards materialist reductive explanations, and I have no strong spiritual or religious inclinations. I hoped for a materialist theory. When I gave up at this hope, it was quite reluctantly. So there are people in your field that I read, and I'm not an expert in your field, who take dualism now more seriously than they did before, because there are many kinds of dualism. But the key point, I think, on which we agree actually, is the vast significance of information. Now, you and I know it's very difficult to define, but what we've got is language like information. I'm not talking about Shannon information. I'm talking about the information that we've got in the DNA code and in the patterns, as I understand them, that you mentioned. And you made the point that information is something more than material. I think that was the way you put it. Now, I would say, yes, it is. And if you are a naturalist, what do you get it from? I want to say that information, although, quoting you, I think that information is usually embedded in some kind of physical system. Information itself is not material. It's not material at all. And therefore, it seems to me that one of the greatest ironies of 21st century science is we've lived to a stage where many of my physicist colleagues regard information as a fundamental quantity that is independent of mass energy. And in fact, people like Anton Zeilinger in Vienna, you probably know him, the teleportation man, will tend to argue that this world is a quantum world. Why? Well, actually, because information is quantized, yes or no, the fundamental notion of information. And so you get beautiful articles written like this. It's not bit from it, it's it from bit. In other words, information is the fundamental quantity. Now, why? Of course, from where I sit, this is fascinating, because the biblical statement, in the beginning was the word, logos, information, code, and so on. All things came to be through him, is saying that the mass energy is derivative. In other words, if you want to use the word emergent, your examples were all intelligently designed things. I would want to say, follow that track. And what we've got actually is emergence, but it's emergence from an intelligent input. And so I tend to turn the whole thing, as you see now, upside down. So we don't destroy the person, far from it. It's the person that is the primary thing. The fact that all the atoms in my body are different every 7 years is evidence of that. There is a pattern that's maintained. And that ought to guide us to the fact that there may be a bigger maintainer of patterns called God. So all of this fits, and to my mind, we've reached what is the central, for me, evidence coming from the scientific world, the sheer importance of information. And the fact that, let me put this carefully, that it converges with the biblical revelation. In the biblical story of creation, and it doesn't say much about creation in the Bible. It's not a textbook of science. I agree with Peter there. It's dealing with much more important things on how we live and so on. But "and God said, and God said, and God said" is a profound description of a non-closed universe. So I don't believe the universe is a closed system of cause and effect. I believe there have been informational inputs from outside to build it up. And those informational inputs have come from the God who inaugurated it and who holds it in being. So the person is maintained because the person of God is primary, and the self does not disappear at all.
This is a topic which I encourage us to continue at the reception, because I think it's very rich, and I'd actually love to give Peter a chance to respond, but I'm not going to, because I want to keep us on time. And there is a question that I want us to explore, because I think it really gets back to the core of human experience and trying to make meaning out of that experience. And it's really the question of suffering. Suffering in one form or another has always been part of the human condition. People have worked through systems of meaning through the lens of suffering. It's just that important part of the human condition. John, you're going to be speaking at the forum at Harvard Medical School next week on this topic, and it would be interesting to hear from you how your Christian faith, how your belief system helps you to make sense of a universe where there is suffering, particularly a universe created by a good God who loves his creation.
Well, this is the hardest question we all face, I think. And it's a question that's not simply an intellectual question, it's a pastoral question. Cancer looks very different through the eyes of an oncologist and to a young mother of 30 who's been told she's got 2 months to live. And I'm very sensitive to this. When I'm asked this question in an audience like this, there are many people who are hurting very deeply. And I've stood in Auschwitz many times and I've wept every time. So how do you deal with it? Now, I can understand people that become atheists because of the problem of suffering. I really can, and I know many of them. But it seems to me that the problem's not solved. To take Dawkins' view, the universe just is as it is. There's no good, no evil, no justice. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. Now, that's extreme determinism. But it's where his worldview leads, and it leads to a world without good and without evil and without justice. And that is a hopeless situation. So I say to people, look, I understand you if you go down the atheist route here, but let me tell you something. You may feel you've solved the problem intellectually, but you haven't removed the suffering. It's still there. Secondly, you've removed all hope by definition, because if there is no afterlife, and for me the evidence for that is Jesus' resurrection, then there's no hope whatsoever. There's no hope of redress, and justice becomes an illusion. Now, I want to address that question, and it's a question I've thought about all my life long, because it's the hard question, and the very short answer, and it's not an answer, I don't like the word answer here, because these things are very deep, but let me put it this way. You see, it goes to the heart of my worldview, and at the heart of my worldview there's a cross. Now, it may be hard for some people to follow this, but it helps you to decide about Christianity if you first hear what it says. And what it says is this, that Jesus was God. And we know he was crucified. So what's God doing on a cross, if that really is God? And my response to that is, at the very least, it means that God has not remained distant from the problem of human suffering, but has himself become part of it. Now, that's a window through which we can begin to go. And you see, if I thought that Jesus died and didn't rise, I would have no hope, none whatsoever. But because he rose from the dead to demonstrate who he was, that he was God incarnate and so on, then I look at that cross differently. I see that it's solving a massive number of problems simultaneously. We haven't time to go into them. One, it tells me that there's going to be a judgment. And that's a wonderful thing, because our human hearts, we cry for justice, we long for it. If atheism is true, The vast majority of people who've ever lived will never get justice in this world, and there's no other world for them to get it in. So it's a hopeless philosophy. Now, I have a problem because I believe in God, but I firmly believe in a God who sees everybody and who is perfectly capable of compensating and will, in the end, do what's right and be seen to be done what's right, so that we will have no further questions. So as I treat this thing, I say, well, let me put it this way. Personally, my life has been saved by last-minute medical intervention about 7 years ago. I was dying, I had no hope. I was saved. And people say, do you thank God for that? I say yes, but let me tell you something. In the same year, my niece of 22 had a brain tumor that carried her away. And I say, do I thank God for that? I need to be careful what I say about myself. So for me, the only way that makes sense to me of getting into this question is the sheer bigness of the Christian story that tells me about a death and a resurrection that shows me the very heart of God. And therefore, that's for me the center. We're created as human beings with the capacity to love. And my main reason for believing in God is the absolutely unbelievable demonstration of the fact that he loved me and he died for me. Now, that may sound to people to be awful sentiment. But if it's true, ladies and gentlemen, it is the biggest thing in all of God's universe. And I have seen again and again people have hope come to them. I stood in Christchurch less than a week after the earthquake, talking to people that had lost their husbands, lost their wives, and so on. And what I discovered was, quietly sitting with them, I couldn't take their immediate pain away. But when you have person after person saying, I can begin to see hope, that doesn't prove it true, but it doesn't prove it's false. And it all hangs round something I believe that happened in space, time, and history, and that's the resurrection of Jesus.
Thanks. Peter, same question to you. As you contemplate suffering in the world, suffering you may have experienced in your own life, how do you work through that? Is there meaning in that? And how do you explain it?
Right. Honestly, I would really love it if there were a caring God who would judge Hitler and make him burn in hell forever. I would love it if, people wouldn't have to suffer apparently pointlessly. But again, wishing something to be true doesn't make it true. And I think we have to be especially skeptical of things that we want to be true, because we're prone to self-delusion, and I suspect, there's a lot of contingency in what people tend to believe. I personally don't think it's that important what people believe. I'm much more interested in how they are and what they do. I look at suffering through the framework of a naturalist. I don't believe that Christ was resurrected. I don't believe that Christ was the Son of God. I believe he was a man, and I find his story even more moving, actually, when you really think about what he endured and did. It's incredible, right? He stood up to the power structure of his day and showed them their hypocrisy. He stood up to the Romans. He introduced a new conception of the divine, of God, as love as opposed to vengeance. I mean, it's that would have been easy for God, but for a man, it's just mind-blowing. It's very comforting. That doesn't make it true. Now, taking a naturalistic view towards suffering, suffering is synonymous, I think, with pain. I think pain evolved through natural selection as a signal that you need to stop what you're doing because you're causing damage. Now, that could be bodily pain, and you have pain receptors, and if those signals are not obeyed, you'll damage your tissues and you'll die. And you can imagine some animal that would feel pleasure upon burning itself or cutting itself, and it would get infections and it would die. So you can see how natural selection would weed out that propensity. But of course, it's not only just physical pain. There's emotional pain, losing loved ones. There's the pain of alienation. And these, I think, also evolved as signals to help guide us towards certain kinds of outcomes. But we also know that these signals, physical pain, emotional pain, maybe even spiritual pain, can go awry. And that people can actually feel these signals inappropriately. So people who suffer from depression are suffering emotionally needlessly. And I think that this can be corrected. And the correct way to correct this in situations like this is perhaps to change the neural circuits that lead to that. So we have a researcher here called Paul Holtzheimer, and he and his colleagues have discovered a new method that involves deep brain stimulation. And it came originally from the deep brain stimulation used in the Parkinson's patients. So the Parkinson's patients would have a tremor. They would implant the electrode in a particular nucleus of the subcortical brain, and the person's tremor would go away. They'd turn it off, and they would tremor. So then they had the hunch, well, maybe we have a circuit underlying the terrible pain of depression that is running amok. And they used MRI, and they found that a particular area right behind your forehead, just underneath the very front of the corpus callosum, in the medial part of your brain, seems to be overly active. And they said, okay, well, why don't we stimulate there and see what happens? And they did. And people who were utterly depressed, who were suicidal, for whom nothing else had worked, instantly were like, oh, I feel great. And then weird things happen, too, that I can't explain. They would say, who turned the lights on? Why is everything so bright? So there's a lot we don't understand. I think some suffering is unnecessary, like the suffering of depression. I also think some suffering is inevitable. Aging, death, this is inescapable, and the best we can do is accept it. Maybe technologies will come along that will allow us to live forever. I think that would be, kind of a disaster ecologically. I mean, it's okay for me. Yes. All right, so, and also as a psychologist, not just as a neuroscientist, let me say that I think that a lot of the pain in our society is unnecessary. That it arises from not living in a way that we are meant to live. So psychologists now pretty much understand what makes people feel really happy. And it's not winning the lottery. It's not, it's getting a fancy car. It's deep engagement, entering the flow state, or having deep connection, either with your social network, your friends, but with yourself also, with the place you're in. And yet we live in a world that's full of endless distraction. We're constantly getting dinged, we're constantly checking this device or that. I spent 2 years in the Peace Corps in Nepal, and the biggest culture shock I ever had was coming back from Nepal after spending a couple of years in a village. And I heard someone put it this way, that in Nepal, and much of the third world, people are rich in networks, in friendships, and in love and family. They may be poor but poor in net worth, and we're the flip. We're rich in net worth, but poor in networks. We're actually here, I think, the third world of love, the third world of kindness, the third world of family, the third world of friendships. And the root of that, I think, actually is, it's a cause of our suffering, the suffering of alienation. But the root cause of it is a kind of worldview that has gotten out of hand. In a way, capitalism has run amok in our lives. We're looking at everything as a commodity, even ourselves. How can I make myself more saleable on the market, whatever that market may be? So some people might stuff silicone into their breasts to become more saleable on the sex market, and other people might stuff internships in their resumes to become more saleable on the get into medical school market. But the mentality is the same. It's viewing yourself as a thing to be sold. And this is a root of tremendous suffering. I mean, let me give you one final example. I had a student, a young woman, come into my office maybe 5 years ago, and she said, so Professor C, how much community service do I really need to do to get into medical school? And I said, well, as much as lies in the kindness of your heart. And she said, let's not be facetious. Okay. And then I said, if you want my honest opinion, what you need to do is just take a year off. You've been in school since kindergarten, and you're consumed with a kind of careerist mentality. What you should really do is go to Mother Teresa's clinic in Calcutta and work for just a year and come back and we'll talk again. And she walked, I never saw her again. But I have to say, there's a great deal of suffering, and I think it's getting worse. So I was a student here from 80 to 84, and I used to, where my building is now, there used to be a hospital there. on Maynard Street, and I would walk, from the north of campus downtown, and I would very typically see 10 people holding hands or hugging each other, arm in arm. That was normal. Now, I just never see that. You don't see people holding hands. You don't see what you see is this, I think that we have to find a way to rein this in for our own good. Create daily Sabbaths, perhaps, and don't check email. Don't, maybe get rid of your cell phone. Quit Facebook. This stuff is all distracting you from what could make you really happy, which is true and deep connections to other people, to yourself, and what you're doing.
Great, thanks. So I've cut into our time a little bit. Sorry for questions and answers, but that was an important enough question. I didn't want to cut anybody off on it. So thank you for those terrific answers to a very tough question. So we now have come to the time in our program tonight where we've been collecting questions from you via text, and the common themes have been collected by the experts backstage or wherever you were. And so go ahead, read them out for us.
Dr. C suggested that religions of the future will focus on practice rather than belief. The Bible teaches that Christian love is a derivative of God's love. That is, Christian practice is based on belief in the love of God. What will these future religions of the world base their practice on?
Right, so my argument was that in a way I think we're in the middle of a major transformation. And one aspect of that is globalization. Another aspect of it is people, like you who've been to many different countries. Me, I'm half German and half Chinese. People like that didn't exist 200 years ago. And if you look at the history of religions, this is painting a broad brush, and thousands of religions have emerged. People have invented many religions, thousands of gods, and I think it's interesting, the gods that people create. I tend to view it as people projecting their experience onto reality. And so if you're a hunter-gatherer, your main experience is with lots of animals and plants. And so animism is a kind of projection of that. You see the agency of animals. Okay, so there's a kind of agentic force in the animal, maybe a soul. Then people started to live in towns and then cities that had a king with a sort of ruling family. And lo and behold, gods were like a king, maybe Zeus with a ruling family. And then along came the first empires. And lo and behold, something like monotheistic religions emerged that were very much like an emperor over an empire. It was a metaphor. In fact, I think it's quite interesting that the very first sort of monotheistic-like religion was created by a pharaoh, Akhenaten, who was the husband of Nefertiti, lucky guy. So he invents monotheism and he has Nefertiti as a wife. But and now we're entering a new kind of world, which is a world in which empires are not so much about the ruling of land, but the controlling of information, where each person has in the palm of their hand all the information available that exists, available in the palm of their hand. So people's experience is, in a sense, becoming the metaphor of an emperor god ruling an empire, which I think is the traditional Christian metaphor in some ways, has to be transformed to become more relevant to people's lives. I don't think the Roman religions, for example, were extinguished because somebody proved them wrong. I think they simply became irrelevant to people's lives, and the Roman society became vulnerable to new ideas coming in. I think we're vulnerable to new ideas coming in, and I think that those ideas will transform Christianity, Islam, Judaism, perhaps even science. They will be centered, I suspect, on notions of information, in particular consciousness. And I suspect that future versions of Christianity will look very different than the ones that traditionalists maintain now, that are built on having to believe this set of dogmas. And if you don't believe in the resurrection, the whole thing falls apart. I don't see it that way. I think that, I find it kind of ironic that Jesus himself spoke primarily in parables and metaphors and allegories, and yet people take the Bible literally. You can take it metaphorically, and it's very profound. And I believe that the influx of the Eastern religions is going to have very profound implications. So when I was a kid, nobody did yoga, and now everybody does yoga. The janitor does yoga. I mean, it's incredible. The world has been transformed very fundamentally. And what these practices, coming from the East primarily, offer is the possibility of transforming your consciousness. What they all seem to have in common is the training of your attentional system. So you have, meditation by attending your breath, paying attention to a mandala, a picture, paying attention to a sound, a mantra. But they all seem to be involved in actually transforming your brain by changing your attentional system, your volitional attentional system. You change what your conscious experience will be. So I think that's very transformative, and we're going to see a continuation in that direction and a de-emphasis in coming generations upon basing a spiritual life upon dogmas, beliefs.
Professor Lennox.
Oh, yes, I
Would you like to
do.
respond?
Yes, I do want to respond to that. In as much as I understood the question and listening to Peter's response, there was quite a bit of Freudianism in there, so let me just comment on that. This idea that has been referred to several times, that something is not true because it's comforting, and the idea of the gods are projections of the imagination, that is, of course, true of many gods. But just because something is comforting doesn't mean it's false. And secondly, atheism is found by many people to be extremely comforting. That doesn't mean it's true. And I think C.S. Lewis's point is worth bringing in here. He said, of course, my desire for something does not make it true or false. But on the other hand, he said, if we find ourselves thirsty, it would be very strange to have that experience in a universe where there was no water. If we find ourselves with a desire for intimacy, it would be very strange if there was nothing corresponding to it in the universe like sex. And so I would want to argue, although that's true, it's only partly true, that if you say it would be very comforting and I would like to believe, that may be an indicator that actually it's true, that you're responding to something very deep within your own person. And so the question is there evidence that it's true? Now, on the Freudian projection thing, which is very important, Manfred Lutz, who's one of Germany's leading psychiatrists, has just written a wonderful book, Eine kleine Geschichte des Größten, a brief history of the great one. And he makes the point, if there is no God, then the Freudian explanation works brilliantly to say that religion is, of course, a delusion and the gods are projections of our imagination, etc. If there is no God. Of course, he points out, if there is a God, the exact same argument works in reverse. To point out, as I think it was Czesław Miłosz, the Nobel Prize winner, laureate for literature in Poland, pointed out that atheism is a great opiate of the people. The desire never to have to be accountable to God. And Lutz's bottom line is very powerful. He says, as for the substantive question of whether there's a God or not, neither Jung, Frankl, or Freud can help you at all. You've got to look elsewhere. And as for the future of Christianity, I will agree with you, Peter, now for a little bit, that we have been beset by the false kind of dogma and so on. Jesus said, I am the door. I've never met anybody who took that literally. The point is, the Bible, like any other book, is full of metaphor. But the mistake that's often made in discussing this is metaphor we use to stand for reality. In all of our work in science, we have to use metaphors all the time, but we use them to stand for realities. So just because it's a metaphor doesn't mean it doesn't stand for a reality. Secondly, we need to be very critical of what our belief system actually teaches. What I mean by that is this. I come from Northern Ireland, and at the very beginning I mentioned this, that people expect me to be belligerent and, using the gun and all this kind of thing to defend Christianity. Now, the point is, that kind of action, which has occurred around the world, where fundamentalist people have pointed guns, shot each other in the name of religion and in the name of Christianity, I think the way to solve that is to go back to what Christ taught. And the striking thing here is that he was tried, put on trial historically, for the very accusation that is made often by people like Christopher Hitchens, that Christianity foments violence. Christ was tried on that charge and declared innocent. And he said, my kingdom is not of this world, otherwise my servants would have been fighting. So what I find very important is to go past the institutions, which often put people off, I'm afraid. Why? Because they haven't followed the basic teaching. And I once said to Christopher Hitchens, I said, Christopher, I don't understand you. You are rightly critical of all the kind of religious hypocrisy, exploitation, all this kind of thing. But Christ was critical of it. Why aren't you on his side? Why are you criticizing him? And the things you so beautifully said at the end of your last contribution on suffering, looking around at the world and seeing the lack of kindness and so on. If we followed the teaching of Christ, this world would be a very different place, because we would care for one another, we would love one another, and so on. So people that do these things and claim to be Christian aren't Christian at all, because they're disobeying Christ, they're not following him. So what I'd expect to happen, in answer to your question, is the core things remain the same. Just like basic arithmetic won't change over the next 2,000 years, I expect. And for me, I go back to the resurrection of Christ as the central piece of evidence that has implications for who he is. And that won't change. I don't expect that to change at all. But the way in which we communicate it may well change. And of course, if we got it wrong in terms of caring, in terms of practice, that's got to change, or nobody will ever believe us at all.
May I say something?
Why don't we go to the next question, so we can get a few more in.
I think we have time for one more from the audience. Professor Lennox, how do we move from a worldview of theism to a worldview of Christianity? Is the resurrection really the only evidence we have to determine the truth of Christianity?
Of course not. How do we move from theism to Christianity? Well, I start from the scientific perspective. As I argued earlier, it seems to me that the teaching about logos, the word as being God, fundamental to the universe, that resonates with the whole of science. And I would want to argue, I didn't get time to discuss it, and we didn't, that the rise of science is intimately connected with it. Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Babbage, Clerk Maxwell were all believers in God. And that's not accidental. They were all Christians of one kind or other. But of course, responding to what science can tell us is limited. The Bible admits it. Paul says that as we look at the universe, we can see certain things about God. One, that he exists, and two, that he's powerful. Not a great deal more. So why I'm a Christian, how we get from theism, we need a different kind of evidence. Now, we both agree that science is only part of reality. But there are other parts. History and human experience are two more parts. And so I would want to call upon those, because you will have observed, of course, that Christianity is historical, space-time specific. It's making claims about a certain person at a certain time in history and so on. And so for me, although it would take a long time to explain in detail, for me the predictions that came in advance of Christ, the whole preparation through the Jewish tradition, the prophets, the history of Abraham and so on, and what God taught the people was a preparation for the coming of the Messiah. He didn't arrive unannounced. And what he did in his life, his teaching, his death, his resurrection, his ascension, is all part, and I want to ask my question, what evidence is there that these things are true? Now, as Peter pointed out, we can't repeat the history of the universe to see what happened at the beginning. We can only make inferences. We can't repeat the history of Christianity to see exactly what happened. But I believe we can make powerful inferences to come to conclusions which many people have come to, starting from a completely antagonistic perspective. But there's a second way of testing it, and that is Christ makes certain claims about what happens if we trust him and respond to him. Do they work? the proof of the pudding's in the eating. And so I would want to argue, for instance, that Christ claims he can transform a person's life if they trust him and they repent, and he can change their lives. Now, I've seen that happen so many times in absolutely tangible ways, where a violent husband is transformed into a loving husband, where divorce is arrested, where relationships get put together. And when you see that again and again and again, and I would say as well that I've been married 46 years, and what has held us in that bond and our children is the fact that we have a relationship with God. And the question of forgiveness, I find I'm in a mess as a human being. I've done wrong. And those questions of guilt and forgiveness, I find they're actually solved in a real way. So to me, there's an objective side, the historical, the evidence in science and the universe. But by far the most important is I discover it actually works. And the Christian faith has given me such a network of friends around the world. In fact, many departments where I come to say, we don't understand you. Why not? Well, everybody else that comes we have to entertain, and they've no friends, and we're bored out of our minds looking after them every night, but you seem to have instant friends wherever you go. So all those things add up for me to actually tangible evidence, not proof in the mathematical sense, you'll never get that, but tangible evidence that it's true. The final point I would make is, you say why Christianity and not just theism, and why Christianity and not anything else? At this level, I'll be absolutely frank. As I look at other people, everyone is made in the image of God and therefore deserving of vast respect. And you look around the religions of the world and you'll find that generally speaking, there's a common moral core. Otherwise, society would completely fall apart. Every single religion in the world, from Confucianism to pagan Roman religion, has got the golden rule. But where the difference lies, to my mind, very clearly is this. Most religions, and some interpretations of Christianity, are a kind of way on which you try to stay, you try and keep the teaching. One day you're going to be assessed, and you're going to be accepted by God on the basis of merit or not. And that's what many people find a slavery about religion. I have to keep these rules, and I'm, etc., etc. But the wonderful thing to my mind about Christianity is it's not like that at all. That Christ's prepared to receive me, not at the end of life, after I've worked hard at it and gained approbation and so on. He's prepared to accept me if I trust him right now. And that is such a phenomenal thing. It's like my marriage, you know. When I proposed to my wife, I didn't say, here's a cookbook. It's got lots of laws. If you keep them for 30 years, then I'll accept you. Well, I'm glad you laugh, because that's how millions of people think of God. If I keep your rules, then you'll accept me. No, I accepted her at the beginning, and she accepted me for some reason. And that's what set us free to live. And you see, the marvelous thing is, she lives and cooks brilliantly, not to gain my acceptance, but because she's got it. Now, my final point on this is that Jesus Christ competes with no other religion on earth on this score, because there's no other religion offers me what he offers me, and that is forgiveness at the beginning, so that I now live not to gain acceptance, but because I've got it. There's no competition here, because he uniquely offers it to me. So that's a sort of brief summary, as brief as I can make it anyway.
So we are about out of time. I'll give you one chance. Final word? Why don't we give Peter one final word here, relatively brief, because it is getting late, and so please.
So my suspicion is that had Dr. Lennox been born in rural India, he would be Hindu, and equally convinced of that. Had he been born in rural China, he would be Confucian, perhaps Buddhist, like my father. Had he been born in Cologne, Germany, he would be Lutheran, like my mother, and equally convinced of that, and arguing that this is the best of all possible worlds. Let me also point out, human beings have come up with thousands, maybe tens of thousands of religions and gods. Dr. Lennox is also an atheist about those other vast majority of them. It's only this particular one must be true that he happened to grow up with and happened to be born into. And I think, the message of Jesus is beautiful. I don't deny that. But I don't believe it's necessary to believe that he was the Son of God or resurrected or actually that he's out there for belief in him to help a marriage. Maybe it's the belief in his message that's helping the marriage. It doesn't mean that he has to exist out there. I'll stop there. Since we're
Well, I'd just like one word, Peter.
All right.
Because if I'd been born in India, I might well have been a Hindu. And that's why I've spent my entire life exposing my faith to its opposite in order to answer that question. The motto of this university is Vox clamans in deserto, a voice crying in the wilderness. Might be a good time to listen to that voice. Thank you.
Thank you to both Peter and to John.
Thank you. That's a wonderful.
Really well done, guys. Thanks very much. Let's just take a seat for a minute and then we'll head out.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.